Hello everyone, Blackwell here. Today I'm doing a deck tech for Uzuri Switchblade in Classic Constructed for Flesh and Blood. This is the deck I played at US Nationals. I finished 75th out of about 540 people. I'm pretty happy with how the deck performed over the course of the weekend, so I'm going to go over my card choices as well as some general tips for playing the deck. Now to start with, we have Uzuri, whose hero power effectively lets you swap in an attack action card with cost 2 or less for one of her stealth cards. Now it does this by banishing the card first, giving your opponent a window to respond. So one of the bluffs you can do with Uzuri is you're allowed to banish any card. You just only put it in if it's an attack action with cost 2 or less. And a lot of times opponents will de-react after you banish the card, but before you put it in order to play around Command and Conquer, because once that Command and Conquer gets flipped face up, they will no longer be able to de-react. So, if you're pretty sure your opponent has a de-react they're holding on to in Arsenal, for example, you can bluff with an extra card in hand. Say if you get, stuck with an extra attack, you're not going to be able to play that turn when your arsenal's already full to try and bait out that de-react. I wouldn't recommend doing it a whole lot. It's a very corner case thing, but it is one of the neat tricks I wanted to point out with their hero power. Next up, we're going on to the standard equipment suite I run against non-arcane heroes. So to begin with, we have Mask of Perdition in the head slot. This mask allows you to make one of your assassin attacks banish a card from the top of your opponent's library on hit. The main way to use this is to generate additional silver for your attack, your contract attack action cards. Now, where it can also come in useful is because its ability is an attack reaction, it can turn on Shakedown if you're just playing Shakedown, not swapping it in with Uzuri's ability. If you're able to get back Mask of Perdition a few times over the course of the game through that silver generation on your contract cards, it can be very useful for hitting that 4-block breakpoint against cards like Snatch. So this is probably at its best against, for example, Runeblade and Ninja, where you're able to generate silver a bit more easily because they won't be blocking as much, and you'll be able to hit those important 4-block breakpoints. Next up, we have Flick Knives. Flick Knives will let you throw your dagger at your opponent. The main use of this is that you get to threaten a lot more damage in the late game because your opponent can't go to 2 life, or they'll just die to flicking both of your knives over the next 2 turns. It is a once per turn effect. The other trick you can do with this is if you have a Nerve Scalpel. Nerve Scalpel lowers the defense of reaction cards because when defense reactions are played, they don't immediately resolve to the combat chain as a defending card right after they're played, and you get a chance to respond. If you Flick Knives a Nerve Scalpel, you'll be able to lower the defense of that de-react by 1. So this can be very good, for example, if you're coming in with a surgical extraction and your opponent blocks with a defense reaction for exactly 4, flicking your Nerve Scalpel before that defense reaction resolves will make it so your surgical extraction still hits for 1. Next up, we have Fiendel's Spring Tunic in the chest slot. I don't think this needs too much introduction, but effectively what it does is it gives you an extra resource every 3 turns. Now, Fiendel's Spring Tunic is going to line up particularly well with some plays in Uzuri. For example, one of the main ones is with the card Death Touch. Death Touch can only be played from your arsenal and it costs 1. So one of the key ways to take tempo back in this deck is if you have Arsenal to Death Touch and your Tunic ticks up to 3, you're able to go on a turn, block out with your whole hand, then on your turn, just activate Tunic, come in with Death Touch for 6. It's a very strong play that can get you back some tempo if you've lost it in the mid-game. Next up, we have Black Tech Whisperers. This destroys as an attack reaction to give one of your assassin attacks on hit go again. Similar to Mask of Perdition, it comes back for 2 silver, and similar to Mask of Perdition, it can be very useful for hitting those key 4 block or 7 block breakpoints. What I would encourage you to do with black tech is to not get too overzealous with using it early. You want to make sure you get the block value out of it and try to set up really strong plays. Like, for example, coming in with multiple of your 6 attack cards on a turn, such as a Death Touch and a Shakedown, ideally with one of your shreds as backup, so you can be ensure that on-hit effect goes through, because it can be very easy to get blown out with black tech because it only gives on-hit go again. So a D-react can ruin your plans. Next up, we have the daggers. I am running the full set of 4. We've gone over already a bit of what Nerve Scalpel can do. Typically, in a lot of matchups, you default to Spider's Bite and Nerve Scalpel because a lot of people play attack actions and a lot of people play defense reactions. Against wizards, you're going to default to Orbitoclast. Scale Peeler is there mostly for the warrior matchup because, for example, with Dory, reactions, specifically attack reactions, are what they're going to block with the most, and then they have a lot of block in their equipment, so being able to take them off that with Scale Peeler is good. I also like to bring in Scale Peeler sometimes against Runeblade because they have such a mix of card types that coming in with Spider's Bite or Bitoclast isn't necessarily a great option because they can always just block with whichever one you didn't attack with. Furthermore, Scale Peeler throws off temper equipment because of the way temper equipment is worded. If an opponent blocks with a 2-block temper equipment after a Scale Peeler has hit them, the temper equipment will break because it will reduce the temper equipment's block by 1. So it'll have the minus counter put on it, be reduced by 1, and then it will break. So very useful against, sometimes even Guardians if they're running a lot of temper equipment, although I would still recommend defaulting to Nerve Scalpel and Spider's Bite in the Bravo matchup. Next up, we have our pieces of AB. These come in against Kano and Icelander. If you find yourself against a Runeblade and you want one piece of AB in order to AB away those rune chants, you want to go for null rune gloves generally, and keep yourself on the ability to have 2 daggers. Now we come to the main deck. I'm going to start by going over the main attacks that we're looking to swap in with Uzuri's ability. So the 3 sort of default ones are Shakedown, Command and Conquer, and Death Touch. All of them can be very strong, and it's often a guessing game from your opponent as to which one you're going to swap in. This is one of the strengths of Uzuri as a hero because your opponent will be playing around things and potentially making suboptimal plays based on what they think you might be doing, because each of these 3 cards demands different play from your opponent. For example, against a Command and Conquer, they don't want to arsenal an important card for a future turn if there's a threat of, for example, an Isolate into Command and Conquer coming up. Similarly, with Shakedown, your opponent has the threat of losing a card out of their hand, so then maybe, they do want to have something in Arsenal. So this uncertainty can force your opponent to make a lot of difficult decisions. As far as I'm aware, these 3 are pretty standard in any Uzuri deck. I would recommend running this full suite. Next up, we have a bit of a flex spot. Right now, I'm running Censor. So this is a card that you can swap in with Uzuri's ability. You could come in with it off of a Tunic because it only costs 1, or you could do something like a blue, pitching to come in with a dagger and then coming with a Censor after that. If you don't know already, Censor makes it so that when it hits, you name a card, and your opponent cannot play the named card until the end of their next turn. One of the cheeky plays you can do with Censor is if you either have Tunic up or you have a resource floating when you play Codex of Frailty, you can get back a censor, come at them with the censor, and if it hits, just name whatever card they got back off of the Codex of Frailty. So again, doesn't come up too much, but it is a cheeky little play you can do. Now, Censor is one of those cards that demands a good amount of metagame knowledge just to be able to know what cards are in your opponent's deck and what are the key cards that you want to name with it. So if you are newer to the game, I'd recommend trying out a different card other than this. For example, I have Amnesia in my sideboard, and I think that would be fine to have in the main deck instead of Censor. Next up, we have some contract cards. I am running a version of Uzuri that plays these contract cards. However, I'm running a low number of the red contracts. So the main ones I have are Leave No Witnesses, Plunder the Poor, and Slay the Scholars. Leave No Witnesses is absolutely a staple in Uzuri due to the interaction with Codex of Frailty. Without any resources floating, you can play Codex of Frailty off of a one-card hand, getting back Leave No Witnesses, and threatening whatever card your opponent got back on their end. So that can be a very strong tempo play, and it makes it so that they effectively have to block or they will be down a card. And forcing that sort of interaction in a game where a lot of opponents want to be able to keep their whole hand is key. Now, Plunder the Poor and Slay the Scholars don't give you that same kind of interaction. They're just threatening banish on your opponent's end. However, the fact that they're 0 for 4s and block for 3 makes them pretty low opportunity costs, and I've been happy with where they are in the deck. I wouldn't necessarily go any higher, however. And Slay the Scholars in particular is one of the first cards that I cut when I'm making sideboard decisions. Next up, rounding out the red attacks, we have 3 Enlightened Strike, 2 looking for scrap. Now, Enlightened Strike is a bit of a filler card, but it's the kind of filler card that can be really good to have in a deck like Uzuri, where it can be difficult to use your whole hand, because Enlightened Strike can fix whatever is going on. It can give you Go Again. If, say, you find yourself with a full 4-card hand that you need to use, you can go 0 for 5 Go Again, ditching one of your other cards, and then come in with a Stealth and a 6, or just pitching for a 6. It can just be a 0 for 7 on a 2-card hand to threaten some big damage. So I've been very happy with it. In a similar function as looking for a scrap, this is going to be a 1 for 5 Go Again, as long as you have a 1 attack card in your graveyard that you can banish. Looking for Scrap is another one of the cards that can use a Tunic resource well, because you can Tunic resource for Looking for Scrap and then do a stealth attack line with Uzuri. It can also be useful to, for example, go Looking for Scrap, pitching a blue, then come in with a Command and Conquer. You don't have to necessarily always use Uzuri's ability if it's more efficient for you to do it another way. Next up, to round out the reds, we have 1 Razor Reflex. This card is something that people will often not expect. It's a good way to get more value out of a turn with, say, a Death Touch or an Enlightened Strike. Coming in with an Enlightened Strike for 7 is something people will often not block, just on the basis that it doesn't have an on-hit effect. But if you're then able to come in with a Razor Reflex to give it Go Again, and then follow it up with one of your attacks that does have an interactive effect, that can completely throw off an opponent's turn and present a lot of damage as well. Then I'm playing 3 Sink Belows. Strong defense reaction, can help fix hands. Not a whole lot to say here. Next up, we are playing the full Rainbow Isolate. I firmly believe that this is the strongest of the stealth cards you can play in Uzuri. Now, the thing with Isolate is, against more defensive decks, it can often be some amount of guaranteed damage. Once you work through your opponent's D-reacts and equipment, they will no longer be able to block out something like Isolate into Command and Conquer or Isolate into Shakedown. So this can be one of the key ways that you are able to force through damage in order to close out a game. Do note that this does not prevent your opponent from playing another D-React from hand after you've switched in your card. So that's very important to remember. The other thing with these is if you have to make a decision between keeping a blue or a yellow in your deck, and the red, tend to default towards the blue and the yellows because the damage on these doesn't really matter and you'd rather have that pitch value in order to swing with your daggers. Coming into more of the yellows, we have 3 Codex of Frailty. This is arguably the strongest card in the deck and the whole reason to play Uzuri, or one of the main reasons to play Uzuri. As I mentioned before, the ability to Codex of Frailty back a Leave No Witnesses can be a strong tempo play. It's also disruptive to your opponent if they have an open arsenal slot because you're making them discard a card. You'll often find while playing Uzuri, if you do something like swing in with a Spider's Bite, leaving 2 resources floating because you overpitch with a red and a blue, into Codex of Frailty, getting back Command and Conquer, you're now threatening your opponent's arsenal. They're down to a 3-card hand because they had to discard, and their attack actions are now only blocking for 2. So you can potentially strip your opponent of their entire hand, or hit them for 6 and still take away one of their cards. So there's a lot of different lines of play you can do with Codex of Frailty. If you're just learning the deck, I'd recommend trying a lot of different play lines, see what works, what doesn't, and go from there. Usually, default towards playing this if you can, rather than pitching it away for later. The tempo swings can be really big. On the opposite end is a card that you often do want to pitch away for later, and that is Spreading Plague. Spreading Plague can be a great way to close out games. Once you get towards the end of the game and your opponent maybe has run out of a lot of their D-Reacts, they might default towards overblocking. And Spreading Plague is one of those cards that can punish it because you'll give them a Blood Rot for each card that's blocking. Note that it does count equipment as well, so it can be very useful there. This is another good one to leave a Tunic resource up floating for in order to, play your Spreading Plague. That being said, don't be afraid to pitch this away or block with it. This is the kind of card that can get stuck in your hand pretty easily because it is dependent on your opponent blocking. Last thing is, this is one of your best turn 0 cards. People will often just block with their full hand on turn 0 because they're going to draw back up anyway. And if you're able to give them a whole lot of Blood Rots that will then affect their turn 1 when the cards in their hand do matter, that can be a very strong play to start out. I'm playing a Plague Hive. You don't really need to. The card can sometimes be amazing, and sometimes it can lose you the game because it doesn't block. So, just personal preference. I like playing it. I like rolling to see which affliction I give my opponent, but it's not that important. Next up, we come to Shreds. I am only playing yellow Shreds right now. Part of that is because control decks aren't quite as popular in the meta, and Shred is a card that depends on your opponent blocking in order to be useful. I really like it at yellow because it can pitch to play our 2 for 6s, and most cards in Classic Constructed block for 3 anyway, so red Shred is really only better against D-React, so it's more situational. So I've been very happy with yellow. If we do find ourselves in a spot where there are more control decks in the meta, for example, there are more people playing Pistol Dash, or there are more people on the Fatigue Briar list, although I believe Briar just Living Legend did, but, in the near future, I could see going to red Shreds in the sideboard, or maybe even some blue Shreds, but right now I've been happy with just the yellows. Next up, we come to the blue stealth cards. Now, I am playing quite a lot of these, 12 in total if you count the isolates I showed earlier. After isolates, I like Backstab because Backstab into Command and Conquer completely negates your opponent's ability to use defense reactions. And then I have Wither and Infect, which just have, I believe, the most relevant on-hit effects. Infect is damage, and then Wither is good in the Lexi meta that we currently find ourselves in. However, the effects on these aren't too important. You're mostly just going to be swapping them out for your 6 attacks. It can be important to block with one or two of these early on in the game in order to enable your looking for a scrap. So you want to make sure you get that going early, just so that if you draw looking for a scrap, it isn't dead. And then lastly, I'm playing 3 Surgical Extraction. This does double duty of being a blue card and being a great card to swap in with Uzuri. Sometimes this can even be more impactful than a shakedown, just because you don't have to name a color before seeing their hand. You're allowed to choose whichever card you want. It is a little more difficult to hit with, because it's only 4, so it gets blocked out entirely by just a defense reaction. So it's often good to either have the Nerve Scalpel Flick Knives trick as backup or one of your shreds. But if this lands, this can be make the difference in how a game goes overall. Next, we come to the sideboard. The way I've set this up is I have 60 cards in main deck, and then I have 10 cards in the sideboard. That's just how I like to approach my deck building. If you like to think about it differently, you could, for example, have a 57 card main deck and then add the sensors to the sideboard. So it's a choice of between Amnesia and Sensor each game. So I have Frailty Trap. The most obvious one this comes in against is Lexi. Lexi's a big part of the meta right now, and Frailty Trap can equal almost up to 6 points of block each turn, 3 on itself, and then if your opponent goes 3 wide with arrows, that would be a total of 6. Notably, this can also turn off Go Again on a Bolton shot if your opponent is giving it +1 off of Voltaire, because Bolton shot only has Go Again while its attack is greater than its base, and the frailty could reduce it back to its base. Next up, we have Amnesia. This mostly comes in against Ninja and Runeblade. It's better against Ninja, but it can also be very strong against Runeblade because it turns off cards that care specifically about how many rune chants you have. It's marginally better than Sensor in those matchups. You do also want to bring it in against Dromai just so you have more poppers. Now, Amnesia isn't amazing, but if you're looking at, hey, what cards can I play in Uzuri, there's not that many 2-cost 6-attack cards that block for 3, and Amnesia is one that, sometimes has a relevant on-hit effect. So that's why I like to play it. Next, we have Warmonger's Diplomacy. Honestly, I was not impressed by this card at Nationals. It's one that has a lot of hype right now as a card that can let you easily get tempo back against, for example, a Ranger or a Runeblade. However, it is very situational. It depends on your opponent's hand being susceptible to it. And in a deck like Uzuri that doesn't have a lot of Go Again on your attacks, you're really the only situation that you're using this in is just playing it off of a 1-card hand and passing back, hoping that it does something to your opponent. So I think it's fine. Moving forward, I'm probably going to swap it out for another Down and Dirty for the Dromai matchup, as I wasn't impressed with this. But as a blue block 3, it's got a pretty high floor on it. So if you have a copy, give it a try, see if you like it. I didn't find it super important. Next, we have Down and Dirty. This is for the Dromai matchup. It's a popper. It pops dragons. Now we have Oasis Respite. This comes in against Kano and Icelander in order to give you more ability to stop their arcane damage. It's very important in the Kano matchup. You often want to just keep it in Arsenal until they have their pop-off turn if you can. Against Icelander, you want to hold on to this for a red Aether Ice Vein if you can. I also like to bring this in against Guardian because it can help you stop the CNC pummel line. Against a CNC, you can block out 6, and then if they pummel, you can Oasis it, which doesn't work, obviously, with a defense reaction. Lastly, you can bring it in the near future against a Runeblade because this can cleanly answer damage from a Rosetta Thorn. Since Briar is living legending, though Rosetta Thorn will soon be out of here. Oh, also, you can bring it in against Vincent if you'd like to, just to stop her pummel lines, because those decks tend to be on a lot of pummels. D-React work there too, though. So anyway, that's the deck. Like I mentioned, there's a couple changes to the sideboard I'd make moving forward, namely swapping out Warmonger's Diplomacy for another Down and Dirty. And if we do see more control decks in the meta, I'd like to work in some red shreds into the sideboard. But I'm going to keep playing this deck moving forward into the ProQuest season, and I'll make a follow-up video if I make significant changes to it. So thank you for watching.